Malaria is an example of a disease that often gets a question in the VCE. Malaria comes from the Latin term using the prefix of mal, which means bad, and the idea of aria, which means air. So the reason they called it malaria was because they thought it was the bad air, that sulphurous smelling stuff that was around the place and absolutely imbued everything to do with the zones where malaria was in high proportions. So that's the origin of the name. The causative pathogen for malaria is the Plasmodium species of different protozoa. So one in particular that often affects people is one called Plasmodium Falciparum. Now this one is the most common. It occurs in about 50% of the cases of malaria, but any species, other Plasmodium species, will cause the effects too. Plasmodium falciparum is the one where you have recurrent bouts. It's not always lethal. The life cycle of this one is what's called indirect. And this is the part where I remind you that means it's going to have an intermediate host as well as a final host. So in this particular case, the method of transmission is by the female Anopheles mosquito, who is the one who will inject her saliva into a human. In the saliva, the protozoa are contained. They go into, therefore, the bloodstream of the recipient, and then they go from there and go through reproduction phases within the body. The purpose for them biting the individual is so they can suck up the blood, and then they use the blood to line their reproductive tract, and that harbours the development of their offspring. So to produce their larvae that they go and lay somewhere else. It just so happens that the blood that they're sucking up from one human, if it contains the protozoa of the Plasmodium species, then that migrates from their gut to their salivary glands, and then it waits for them to re-bite somebody else, and then off goes the cycle again. The signs and symptoms of malaria are alternate bouts of shivering and fever, lethargy, nausea. Now these are quite serious, and they're the outward signs and symptoms. What's going on internally is anemia, because what you do is you break down red blood cells and liver cells as well. The host response is to produce antibodies. But here's the problem. This particular living entity of the protozoa, they are capable of changing the surface antigens on themselves. So even though you're producing antibodies, they relatively are ineffective to the subsequent strains that are going through, hiding in your liver, then coming out of your liver into your bloodstream, reinfecting you. So it's not very effective as a mechanism, and that's why you constantly have these recurring bouts. So just want to remind you that these are protozoa. Methods of treatment, you're going to just treat the symptoms. There's not a lot that can be done for people with malaria generally. So it's analgesics, rest, fluids. Now, because there's an intermediate host and it involves an indirect life cycle, the methods of control, it's not just as simple to quarantine someone, for example, that might have the pathogen. Methods of control, in this case, you can take preventative drugs. Now, here's the thing. Some of these preventative drugs are also used in the methods of treatment. So chloroquine and quinine. You might have heard of quinine before. It's found in tonic water. So if someone has a gin and tonic, quinine's found in that. Quinine and chloroquine are also added to lots of water supplies. So these preventative drugs include chloroquine and quinine because they're hostile to the protozoa. So you can use them as treatment as well as control in this particular case. So people will also take things called anti-malarials prior to visiting an area where the female Anopheles mosquito is prevalent. But there are other methods of control. So if you're thinking about the life cycle, so we're going from mosquito to human, you've got to think, where can I break that cycle? And breaking that cycle would mean things like personal protection against insects, insecticides, long sleeve clothing, mosquito nets over beds, those sorts of things. Here's a little tidbit for you. The female Anopheles mosquito, her wing speed is so high, it's supersonic. That means it's above human hearing and audible range. So when you're home at night and you hear that little zzz just before you're trying to sleep and it's driving you nuts, that's not a female Anopheles mosquito because she is lethal. You don't hear her coming. So that's a nice little tip for you. You're not going to get malaria from a mosquito that you can hear. You might get something else like Ross River fever or dengue fever or something else, but you're not going to get malaria from that one. There's also some other controls. Mosquito, how do you get rid of mosquitoes? You might also do things like draining swamps. Has other consequences to the environment, but that is one method. Or introducing larva-eating fish. They're called larvivorous fish. So fish that will prey upon the larva of the mosquitoes that's laid on the swamp or the lake or the enclosed bit of water. Usually still water is where they like to lay their larva. So if you have fish that eat all the larvae, then you won't get any mosquitoes. If you don't get any mosquitoes, then you can't do that. One of the insecticides that was widely used in terms of into the environment is called DDT, and that is something we'll investigate when we look at evolution, because it's just one of the classes of drugs that was used against insects, but it had its own consequences. So more on that in semester 2.